Thank you so much and welcome to the second annual legislative briefing on the post-General Assembly session here in Virginia. We're delighted to have you join us today with Virginia Funders Network, and I think it's going to be a terrific conversation this afternoon. We're really happy that you can join us. As you know, I'm Robin Mockenhaupt. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy for Virginia Funders Network. And I'd like to just take a minute and introduce Katie Moore, who is the CEO of Virginia Funders Network, and ask Katie if she would just say a word or two about VFN and about our upcoming annual conference, and then we'll move on with the program. Katie.
We have 120 registrants for that conference, so we hope you'll join us too if you haven't already signed up. And we're also looking to do some regional funder lunches. So we're looking to do some of those, kick those off in the summer. We're so excited about being back in person, or the ability to be back in person. So stay tuned for more information about those opportunities. And then finally, this leveraging the power of our network. We really want to continue highlighting emerging trends, topics, and best practices from philanthropy, the philanthropic field at large, as well as what's going on here in the Commonwealth. We're going to continue monitoring state and federal legislative activities. Today is one example of the way that we're doing that. And we're hoping to foster some relationship with national funders too, as we really leverage the power of this collective that we've created here in Virginia. And then, of course, additionally, we want to encourage collaboration across funders and collective action around the issue areas that philanthropy cares about. So it's an exciting second year for VFN. I want to thank the team for all the work that they're doing, and the advisory board members and volunteer leaders who are working furiously behind the scenes. You guys are so appreciated. We could not do this work without you. So welcome to today's session, and Robin, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, Katie, thanks so much for that. And again, for those of you who are just joining, welcome to the post-General Assembly legislative briefing today. As you know, because 2022 was an even-numbered year, the General Assembly met for 60 days in a regular session. And they ended mid-March, but still have a little bit more work to do. And Governor Youngkin has invited the legislature back beginning on Monday to reconvene and for a special session. So we're in this in-between time between when the regular session ended and the special session begins next week. But there's lots to discuss today about what happened during those first 60 days. And we have two outstanding panelists with us today, and we're so appreciative that both of them were able to join us. So the purpose of today's session is to learn the outcomes of what happened during the regular session, 60-day session, and then to discuss the implications and what's coming up in the next few weeks and months and really the remainder of the year. We're going to have plenty of time for Q&A after each of them speaks, so please be thinking already about what it is that you would like to learn about and know what's coming up in the state for the rest of the year. But without further ado, let me introduce our two speakers. The first speaker is Ashley Kenneth, who is the CEO of the Commonwealth Institute. You know, as CEO, Ashley really provides the vision and the strategic direction and management for the organization. And her work and passion to focus on and advance racial and economic justice really maximizes the impact of TCI's work in the state and their policy analysis and legislative engagement, and really strengthens the partnerships that they have with other organizations in Virginia. At VFN, Virginia Funders Network, we're so appreciative of the partnership that we have with TCI, and so delighted that they are a resource here in the state, not only to us, but to all the organizations here. So Ashley used to be the director before TCI of Policy and Advocacy for the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. And last year, she was appointed by Governor Northam to the commission to examine racial and economic inequity in Virginia law. She is a graduate of the Minority Political Leadership Institute at VCU, and she has a BA in Communication and Sociology from the University of California at Santa Barbara, and her master's degree in social policy was received from the University of Pennsylvania School of Social Policy and Practice. So Ashley, welcome, and thank you again for being part of this today. The second speaker is Erik Rison, who is the Vice President of Public Policy and Research at the Virginia Chamber of Commerce. Erik has been with the Chamber since fall of 2018, and as the Vice President of Public Policy and Research, his focus areas are policy development, government relations, and advocacy. He also has a leadership role in addition with the 501c3, the nonprofit education foundation counterpart to Virginia Chamber, the Virginia Chamber Foundation. And through that, he really spearheads the policy development for the Chamber's business plan for the Commonwealth called Blueprint Virginia. And I know that is on the website for the Chamber. And I just actually want to take a minute to commend everyone to look at the websites for both the Commonwealth Institute and for the Virginia Chamber and the Chamber Foundation, because they have a lot of terrific resources listed there for the state. Erik has a decade of experience working in public policy and government, and before the Chamber, he worked with North Highland and KPMG government client project teams, and he used to serve as manager of government affairs for the Health Industry Distributors Association. And he started his career as an LA, a legislative aide in the General Assembly. So he knows a little bit about the General Assembly to share with us today. He graduated in government from the University of Virginia. So Erik, thanks so much for being part of the session today, and welcome to both of you. So here's the lineup for today. We've asked each speaker to talk for about 20 minutes or so about what happened during the 60-day regular session and what they see coming up. And so each person's going to talk for about 20 minutes or so. Then it is your turn to ask questions. So be thinking now about questions that you would like to ask them. You can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Please just post your questions in there. Raise your hand if you would like to be called on, and I may call on you anyway if you post something, but if you would prefer to just post in the chat, that would be fine as well. So be thinking about that already. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A, and then at the end, we'll have a few minutes of announcements and updates before we wrap up the session. So with that, no further ado, Ashley, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Robin. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see my slides. Thank you, Robin, for the invitation to join you all today. It's always a pleasure to speak to VFN and spend some time with you all. I appreciate the conversations that we've had. Again, my name is Ashley Kenneth, and I'm the president and CEO at the Commonwealth Institute. Bill Hernandez, TCI's Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy, was with you all in January at your pre-General Assembly session meeting, and I know that he gave a thorough presentation about some of the things that we are watching for and working on for the legislative session. And my goal for today is to revisit some of the things that Phil spoke about, to talk in depth about the budget and the decisions that are being made, decisions that have deep implications for the ways in which we support those of us who need the most in our community, while also ensuring that we are thinking about future investments. I'll provide an update on some key pieces of legislation and then talk about the work ahead and the essential need for advocacy. First, just some general observations about how the General Assembly and the legislature operated during this pandemic era. The legislators met in person, and in most cases, there was the opportunity for advocates to testify virtually in committee, which is important because although masks were available, they were not required to be worn in the Pocahontas building. There were some exceptions. Some of the subcommittee rooms did not have the technology to allow for virtual testimony, so That's unfortunate because subcommittees are often where the meat of the policy conversations happen. Therefore, it was imperative for advocates to be there in person at times. Another important thing to note is that as a result of the November elections, the legislature is divided in terms of political party control. Republicans have a majority in the House, and the Democrats have a narrow majority in the Senate, and Governor Youngkin is a Republican. So this dynamic has set us up for some challenging situations, and in a way has forced a more moderate approach to legislating this year. There's been significantly, my dog is barking, I apologize. There's been significantly more divisive rhetoric this session. The governor has seemingly taken an opposition to the word equity and has endeavored to remove the word from offices in his administration, but it really hasn't all been about language changes. The administration has opposed cultural competency training for teachers, has attempted to roll back some of the progress that's been made to increase racial equity over the last 2 years via legislation, like the minimum wage increase. But for TCI, advancing racial and economic equity in Virginia remains a core of our work. Generations of underinvestment and intentional policy decisions that have created barriers for low-income Virginians and people of color in the state have to be met with equally intentional policy change that breaks down barriers and creates opportunities. The state budget is at the center of this work. The budget is a moral document that defines who and what we value as a state. From tax policy to the investment choices made, it all matters, and equity matters. So let's take a look at where we are in the state budget process. Looking at this infographic, we are currently stalled at step number 8. The House and Senate money committees have already presented their budget proposals. Each chamber has accepted their budget and rejected the other chamber's budget. A conference committee has been named. They were unable to reach a compromise before session adjourned on March 12th. There are some key sticking points that have led to this stalemate, but a lot of it comes down to taxes. The House has leaned into providing major tax cuts. The Senate is leaning toward providing less tax cuts and instead focusing on stronger investments in public services. The difference in the approaches means that the Senate has $3 billion more to spend on programs, services, and supports than the House. So as we await a conference budget, we'll be watching carefully to see how they balance tax relief with greater investments in public services like education. And it will be interesting to see how Governor Youngkin, who is a political newcomer who campaigned on cutting taxes, will or will not influence the final package. So let's talk about a few budget highlights to give you an idea of just how different the proposals are. Although I'll mention just a few high-level things today, TCI does have a side-by-side of the budget documents on our website, thecommonwealthinstitute.org. But as background, Governor Northam's introduced budget, which was the budget that Youngkin inherited, reflects the fact that Virginia has significantly more resources than originally forecasted, about $14 billion more over the next 2 years. And Governor Northam proposed doing a number of things, increasing our reserves, using cash for projects, as well as providing one-time rebate checks to Virginia tax filers. He also proposed important investments in areas like education and making the state's earned income tax credit refundable, which would put on average about $500 back in the pockets of low-income Virginia tax filers. To pull out just a few highlights of the House proposed budget, access to dental care is an essential health equity issue. Black and Latinx people living in Virginia are less likely to have visited a dentist or dental clinic within the last year compared to the state average. So the House added a 5% increase in dental reimbursement in order to incentivize more dental providers to participate in Virginia's Medicaid program. And that has an estimated budget impact of $7.4 million. The House has proposed a number of investments in education, although their proposals still fall woefully short in comparison to the introduced budget and the Senate proposed budget. The House has called for a 4% salary increase and 1% bonus for teachers. This is a reduction of $68.4 million from the introduced budget, which calls for a 5% increase. The House also provides $210 million less for the at-risk add-on program, which is a program that directs resources to the schools that have the highest share of students living in poverty, and therefore a greater need for resources and supports. The House doesn't adjust funding for English language learner supports, nor do they propose to change the arbitrary support cap. The cap on school support staff was originally imposed to save money during the Great Recession, but it has resulted in hundreds of millions of cuts to state funding for school support staff positions like social workers and custodians and food service staff. And since the support cap was instituted, support staff have actually decreased by 1,700 positions across the state, while student enrollment has increased by 63,000 students. So there's certainly a dire need to address the support cap. The House does provide $104 million for principals and assistant principals, a proposal that the Senate does not have. In terms of housing, the House maintains funding for the Housing Trust Fund, but does eliminate funding for the Housing Innovations and Energy Efficiency Program, which funds upgrades to new and existing residential buildings to reduce bills for low-income Virginians. In contrast, the introduced budget and the Senate budget propose to use $190 million of special funds from the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative for that program over the next 2 years, but the House has proposed to withdraw from RGGI, which would eliminate that revenue source. Data from before the pandemic showed that 2 out of every 3 low-income households face a high energy burden, and Black and Latinx Native American and older adult households face particularly high energy costs compared to their incomes. The House does not propose to increase TANF benefits, and it doesn't include new investments in the Office of New Americans, but they do allocate $5 million for a preservation fund for tribal lands and historic sites of significance for people of color. The Senate has a similar proposal. So taking a look at the Senate proposed budget, the Senate includes a 30% increase in dental service reimbursement as opposed to the House's 5% increase. The Senate's proposal would cost $84.8 million. The Senate also includes language to form a task force to help address the impending Medicaid redetermination process. So when the federal public health emergency expires, all adults and children enrolled in Virginia's Medicaid program will need to undergo eligibility redetermination for the first time since the start of the pandemic. And of course, we know many things have changed for families over the past 2 years, including mailing addresses and contact information. And so it's really vital that this process is well planned, that it's well resourced, and that it's informed by consumers and consumer advocates. Otherwise, there could be a drastic loss of health coverage for thousands of Virginians. The House does not propose any similar program in their budget. And also, unlike the House, the Senate budget proposal includes language for a study to evaluate options to establish a state-funded health coverage option for children who are 19 or under, who are uninsured and would otherwise qualify for Medicaid or FAMUS except for their immigration status. And this is a policy that we've been referring to as Cover All Kids. So looking at education, the Senate calls for a 5% teacher pay increase and also would use $137.4 million of ARPA funds to pay for a 1,000 bonus for teachers and staff. The Senate proposal also includes an increase to the at-risk add-on program of $268.5 million over the biennium. They provide additional funding for positions that support English language learners, as well as partial removal of the support cap by providing nearly $272 million to increase support staff positions in K-12 schools. Overall, the Senate's proposals are about $915 million more than the House proposals for education. There are several major differences between the budget proposals when it comes to housing as well. The Senate increases the Housing Trust Fund by almost $200 million. They also want to develop guidelines for a program that would provide long-term rental assistance, which would be a critical step toward addressing Virginia's housing crisis. Only 1 in 5 eligible households in Virginia receives a federal housing voucher to subsidize their rent. As a result, 85% of extremely low-income renters in Virginia are cost burdened, and 71% of them are severely cost burdened, which increases the risk of eviction and adversely impacts the family's entire well-being. The Senate proposes to increase TANF levels by 10%, which would give people with low incomes greater opportunity to afford and to pay for basic needs such as rent, childcare, transportation. And the last thing I'll mention in terms of investments is immigrant inclusion. The Senate budget provides nearly $12 million to improve language access across all state agencies. This funding would allow each state agency to designate a language access coordinator who will be responsible for making sure that agency materials and communications are accessible to everyone who calls Virginia home. The House budget reduces that funding by about $6.1 million over the biennium. The Senate also includes $8 million to fund a pilot program in the Office of New Americans that would award grants to immigrant and refugee-serving organizations. The grant recipient organizations would then administer comprehensive case management services to individuals and families with limited English proficiency and those undergoing refugee resettlement. And the House does not have such program in their proposed budget. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, in addition to just having different priorities as a result of who is in power in each chamber, the House and the Senate have drastically different budget proposals because they have different amounts of money to spend. And that's primarily because of the tax policy proposals. The House has proposed to double the state standard deduction to $9,000 for an individual and $18,000 for a married couple filing jointly. And this action would reduce state resources by about $2.1 billion over the next 2-year budget, as well as $1.3 billion in the subsequent 2-year budget. The House budget proposes to eliminate both the 1.5% state sales tax on groceries and personal hygiene products and the 1% local sales tax that applies to those items. And one of the concerns with that approach is that localities rely on that local sales tax revenue to fund schools. So the House does have a plan to replace revenues for school divisions and localities. It's not a one-to-one match, but based on a formula. The portion of the tax that goes to transportation would not be backfilled according to the House proposal. The House does also propose that Virginia tax filers receive a rebate of up to $300 per individual and $600 per married couple, which is about $1.25 billion. The Senate, on the other hand, does not propose to double the standard deduction, but instead makes the earned income tax credit fully refundable, a policy that would help many of the low-income tax filers that would not benefit from increasing the standard deduction. The Senate eliminates the state's portion of the grocery and the hygiene sales tax, but it keeps the local portion intact, and it backfills school division funding, but not the transportation funding. The Senate's rebate proposal is $250 per individual, or up to $500 per married couple, which is about $1 billion. So TCI, sorry y'all about this dog. TCI is joining our partners in the Tax Fairness for Virginia coalition to ask that the House and the Senate budget conferees prioritize parents as they're hashing out the final budget, and particularly these tax policy pieces. The final budget should increase investments in K-12 education, and that includes support for the lowest income students. It includes greater teacher pay, more resources for English language learners, and finally addressing the harms caused by that support that I mentioned. Prioritizing parents would mean shifting the tax rebates to include children so that families with children receive a greater amount, and perhaps putting an income cap on the rebates so that the program can be targeted to the people who need the most support. And finally, making the earned income tax credit refundable is essential. Any tax relief that we provide should be targeted and intentional. So that was a lot about the budget. TCI also worked on some individual bills, most of which are related to budget items that I've already mentioned. But one that I haven't mentioned is a bill that we worked on to shorten the statute of limitations on court fines and fees collection which can currently be as long as 60 years. Fines and fees can literally follow people for a lifetime and prevent the family from escaping the cycle of poverty, injustice, and judgment. The bill did not advance this year, unfortunately, but I think that we did do a lot of great education around it and lay the groundwork for future reform. We also played defense on several issues, but I'm particularly proud that we were able to hold the line and prevent any rollback to the scheduled minimum wage increases. So, as Robin mentioned, the governor has called a special session for April 4th. My best guess is that a budget won't be ready at that time, but they'll finish some business they have on some of the remaining legislative items and continue to work on the budget behind closed doors. But of course, that's only a guess. I'm not entirely sure what will take place next week. But in the meantime, we at TCI and our partners and our other advocates will keep advocating for the priorities that we want to see in the budget, and particularly the three cornerstones that I mentioned are needed to prioritize parents. Reconvened session is April 27th, and that is when lawmakers will come together to act on any governor amendments or vetoes on legislation that was passed during the regular session. And with that, I will end, but I encourage everyone to visit our website to sign up for our newsletter and engage with us on social media. When the conference budget is released, we will be updating our side-by-side document to provide a comprehensive look at how many of the key budget policy choices compare. Thank you.
Great. Ashley, thank you so much for that. That was a terrific overview. So much great information. I know there's going to be a lot of questions that come up in the Q&A period, and we love your dog. Obviously has a lot to say. So thank you. It's, life working at home these days. So thank you so much for that overview. And with that, I'll turn it over to Erik Rison from the Virginia Chamber of Commerce. Erik, welcome.
All right. Well, thank you, Robin, for that introduction. And Ashley, what a great presentation. Appreciate you sharing that with us. And I've got a few slides myself. Unfortunately, I didn't have the benefit of Phil speaking ahead of time with some of our pre-session priorities. So I'm going to maybe cover a couple of those in addition to some of the outcomes. And then maybe talk a little bit more about Blueprint Virginia 2030, which was kind of alluded to in the introduction time period earlier. So without further ado, I'll just kind of jump in here to some of my slides. And let's see if I can get this to go. There we are. So the Virginia Chamber of Commerce, our overall goal is to make sure that Virginia is the best state in which to do business. That's our core kind of foundational principle at our organization. And a couple sort of facts here. Back in 2010, when our president and CEO, Barry Duvall, took over, we had about 1,000 business members, and we've really grown our network of member companies to almost 29,000 members in really every corner of the Commonwealth. And we're really proud of that growth, and really we aspire to be the voice of the Virginia business community for our policymakers. So we kind of wear two hats, one of which is kind of keeping our finger on the pulse of what's happening with business, and then communicating what we're hearing from our member companies to policymakers, to legislators, to the executive branch, and so on. A couple of achievements the past few years that Virginia's received. I'm sure you've seen the headlines. We've achieved the Top State for Business award, in large part due to Virginia's very talented workforce and strong education system. We're pretty recognized for our strengths in that area, and that's what's built Virginia up over the past few years, is our strength in those areas. So just wanted to highlight a couple of those. And not saying the Virginia Chamber is the only reason that we're achieving some of these marks, but we've been working in a kind of consistent, strategic fashion to kind of implement business and economic growth oriented policies in the Commonwealth for the past few years. And we had our first blueprint, which we presented to Terry McAuliffe back in 2013 after a year-long process of stakeholder meetings and sessions to kind of pull together what we want Virginia to look like from a business and economic development standpoint across the Commonwealth. And we do this every 4 years. So here's Barry Duvall standing with Terry McAuliffe there presenting the first blueprint. And then 4 years later, we did the same with Governor-elect Ralph Northam. This was in Williamsburg back in 2017 after the governor was elected then. And then, as you could probably guess, we worked the past year leading up to the gubernatorial election back in November. We held about 9 regional meetings, 16 executive committee meetings and touch points, lots of other external speaking engagements on these topics, and engaged hundreds of organizations and over 7,000 Virginians to kind of pull together survey information, really keep our finger on the pulse, as I said earlier, on what's going on in every region of Virginia and every industry, regardless of size or scope. So through that process, we pulled together kind of my effort for the past year or so, which is Blueprint Virginia 2030. And there's our president and CEO, Barry Duvall, presenting this to then Governor-elect Ralph Northam on December 3rd at our economic summit. So very, very proud to have rolled that new plan out. And really what that's led to is our 11 focus areas of Blueprint, which stem from our strengths in workforce and education to business climate, infrastructure, military and veterans affairs, a new focus on safety, preparedness, and resiliency. We're taking some of the lessons that we learned during the pandemic to kind of instill some of those into our overall effort. I know Ashley mentioned the critical component of housing. We like to say housing is where jobs go to sleep at night. And it's critical to have opportunities for affordable and quality living spaces for all Virginians. And so that's one focus area of ours that's more intentionally listed in this iteration of Blueprint. We've added life sciences to our healthcare section as well in this iteration of the Blueprint, really honing in on Virginia's growing strength in the biotechnology kind of areas and increased venture capital investment in that area, as well as certainly federal research grant dollars that are coming to Virginia. In particular, Central Virginia, that kind of pipeline we're seeing build up between some of our universities as well as private industry is really strong and growing. And that kind of leads into the innovation and technology space we have there, as well as advanced manufacturing. One last thing I'll note on this slide, and I'm going to try and get through some of these pretty quickly so we have time for Q&A, but this iteration of Blueprint really does expand our intentional focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I wanted to call that out in particular because we looked at our Blueprint Virginia process in particular this go around with a specific lens towards how do we close some of the existing gaps we're seeing in opportunity across education, across economic opportunities, across entrepreneurism, and in criminal justice reform. So some of those are from our Equality of Opportunity agenda, which we released back in 2020. This slide specifically speaks to the racial gaps on these issues, but certainly could talk about gender disability, veteran status, all sorts of angles there that I'd be happy to go into a little further. But we looked at the document with that specific lens this go around as well, and that's what employers are expecting, our policymakers to consider as well. And so we communicate those issues on behalf of the employer community as well. And I think there's some interesting areas to further some of those goals that will help lift economic prosperity and opportunity for all. And so if you want some more information on that, we've got our website listed there at blueprintvirginia.org. You can find a link to that at vachamber.com as well. But this is where our Blueprint Virginia 2030 kind of interactive website lives, and we have all 11 of those focus areas and their subsections there that talk about our recommendations and aspirational goals for the Commonwealth. So feel free to visit that site at your convenience. But diving into the meat of what we hope to be talking about here, which is the legislative session, Ashley already mentioned we have kind of a new dynamic here in Virginia with the executive branch, obviously. Governor Glenn Youngkin, Lieutenant Governor Winsome Sears, and Attorney General Jason Miyares, all new, all from the Republican Party, and so which is different from our previous three, which were Democrats. And then diving into the new House of Delegates dynamic as well, there was a bit of a sea change there, which led to a 52-48 Republican majority in the House. So narrow, but a change nonetheless. And of course, we have the Speaker, Todd Gilbert, there leading the House of Delegates. These are the 7 seats that were flipped. I won't focus too much on the particular there, but these were the close ones in the election. And a lot of this was already mentioned, so I'll kind of skip through some of these. But specifically for the business community, we had kind of 5 large focus areas for the budget as well as legislation writ large this year. One of our distinct focuses was healthcare for small business. I'll jump into that here shortly. But workforce and education is our bread and butter. It's what we do well in Virginia, but we also stand to improve quite a bit in a lot of areas when it comes to investment, when it comes to talent development in the education field, and also when it comes to school construction. I know Ashley mentioned that topic. That's one that we particularly care about as well, and happy to see that there's going to be some movement in that area this year, regardless of what comes out of the conference report on the budget. Economic development, we're very hopeful for some large investments there to drive existing business growth as well as attract new employers to Virginia, especially areas of Virginia that are struggling to attract employers currently. So we're hopeful there. Business climate, I'll discuss some of those topics, and then of course infrastructure, whether that's roads, bridges, and tunnels, or broadband infrastructure, or our electrical grid and the resources that are transmitted through that electrical grid. So I'll cover those in general here. And to start with, I wanted to talk a little bit about legislation that came through. So Kathy Byron in the House and Senator Monty Mason carried an important bill for us this year that we've been working on the past 4 years that's going to expand, affordable quality options for healthcare for small employers. So think employers that have 2 to 50 employees. It's going to allow those groups to kind of have the purchasing power to pool their risks together and to have access to those plans collectively with the ACA essential health benefit standards in there. And what we envision over time these plans will do is really provide the average small business owner a savings of 15 to 20% on the plans they're able to offer their employees. And That's really significant if you consider the average size small business has 6 employees in Virginia, and that's a savings of almost $20,000 for that small employer if you extrapolate that 15 to 20% over a year there, which in some instances, in some years, can be the difference between being in the red or the black when you're looking at the balance sheet at the end of the year for struggling businesses. So we're really hopeful about that effort. We're excited to see that achieve success. It passed unanimously through the Senate this year, and we really think it can be impactful in the long term while being cooperative and complementary in nature to the individual exchange and other health benefit options that are out there on the market right now. So we're excited about that. Wanted to dive in a little bit deeper there. Happy to answer questions for that one as well. Listing our kind of workforce and education related priorities this past session. Early childhood education continues to be kind of at the core of what we're advocating for, whether it be investments in the budget or for, quality assurance purposes, for workforce development of that industry, because really to get to full participation in our workforce, we've got to have affordable quality options. And so we're continuing our advocacy through partnerships with the Early Childhood Education Foundation, as well as the Virginia Promise Partnership. Happy to see some familiar faces on this call that also participate in that great organization, and we're happy to be members of that group. And talking a little bit further, we've got some both higher ed education related focus areas as well as K-12 standards of quality and additional financial aid resources for students across higher ed, but also specifically at HBCUs regarding capital projects, operating support, Pell Grant eligible individuals, and the like. So we've got more specifics on that. For brevity's sake here, I want to maybe continue on. So these are a few more of our workforce and education legislative priorities. Work-based learning and internships is a huge focus, and where we can really create that stickiness for students in Virginia. So giving employers the opportunity to meet students while they're still in school, allowing students to explore career opportunities, and then for higher educational institutions to partner with those organizations and others to kind of create a holistic educational approach. We think it's a win-win-win scenario to invest more in those scenarios, and it's a great way to keep Virginia students in Virginia after learning in Virginia. So we're hopeful for that effort to better connect Virginia employers, students, and our great educational institutions programs there. Happy to answer any questions on that. I already talked about some of the development and retention components, as well as the repairing school construction related items. Happy to talk more specifically if there's interest there. These are a bunch of programs listed here, so I won't go into too much detail on that, but one of our very specific focuses is on kind of different talent pathways for individuals, making sure there's a career awareness of what's available to students throughout their education, and better connecting those students to opportunities that exist now, but also in the future, making sure we're developing robust skills throughout there. So those are a couple specific bills there too. I'm happy to provide more information on if folks have questions. So military and veteran affairs, Virginia has about 20,000 transitioning service members going out of service every year. We retain about 10,000 of them, but we would love to retain more of those individuals in Virginia. They often have translatable skills, talents, and needs that are, critical to some employers, as well as, they're great members of our community. We'd love to keep more of them. A lot of them are going to Texas or Tennessee or Florida after going out because of some of the incentives those states offer from a tax benefit standpoint. We're starting to explore what some of those might look like from easing a tax burden standpoint. So is the legislature, but we're focused on some of those areas, and then some of the wraparound services that go along with that, like childcare subsidies, specifically to members of the armed forces, and then some of the occupational licensing related components to allow spouses the opportunity to take licensure that they have from other states to apply here in Virginia. So creating that flexibility for dual income for those individuals, where we think is a good idea. Transitioning a little bit to business climate, talked about economic development components, but one major investment that both the House and Senate versions of the budget have focused on is business-ready sites. So the House version has a little north of 160 million focused directly on building out Virginia's portfolio of sites ready for economic development. Virginia has actually been removed from consideration for major auto manufacturing, microchip investments, as well as electrical vehicle kind of opportunities just in the past few months because we didn't have sites ready for development that were turnkey in nature, and other states did. These companies we're hearing, we love your workforce, we love all the infrastructure around it, but they could get started in 6 months at the other state when it would take 2 to 2.5 years here in Virginia. So we're playing a little catch up with competitor states, and those sort of investments would be extremely helpful to make sure Virginia is just not removed outright when in consideration for those sort of jobs. Regulatory reform. There were some changes to some permitting related items this year regarding some citizen appointed boards. We worked and had efforts to improve some of those from a regulatory reform standpoint. Happy to dive into that if there's interest. And then lastly, I actually mentioned a lot of the components regarding the different tax proposals in the bills, the House approach versus the Senate approach. We have not been advocating for any repeal of the grocery tax or repeal of the fuel tax, but it seems like some measures on that are going to go forward in whatever iteration comes out. So we're tracking those and the impacts it will have on the budget on our end. And then, from a tax specific component, we're also tracking some very specific minutia on business interest deductions and the like. Happy to answer any questions you might have on that one as well. Let's see, and then ending really with our housing legislative priorities. We're hopeful that there will be some additional funding regarding both the supply of affordable and quality housing, but also additional components for grants for individuals that are getting into the home buying process or in a rental process based off of need and ability to pay. So those are some components there. If there's interest, I could dive into both energy and the environment as well, but I want to be mindful of Q&A and the time we have set aside for that as well. So I'll wrap up here and appreciate your attention on those topics.
Great, Erik, thank you so much for that overview. And I think those of you participating today would agree that those were two terrific overviews of what happened during the General Assembly session. So I'm going to start with the question, but while our speakers are answering that, please put your comments and your questions in the chat. This is your opportunity to have two experts talk to you about what they're seeing, what they saw, and what they're seeing coming up. So both of you, Ashley and Erik, talked about the legislative priorities, the wins that you were involved with, and the engagement during the session. I'm wondering if you're expecting coming up in your crystal ball any budget surprises and whether or not that might have any implications for your policy and advocacy agendas for the coming year. So it's inviting you to do a little crystal balling if you'd like to, but just any implications for your own policy agendas, depending on what happens in the General Assembly.
Well, I'll just say, and I thought Ashley's chart did a really good job of this, but approximately $3 billion gap between the two. That's a lot of room for surprises. I think both chambers are going to have to get pretty creative in their negotiations to find common ground. And also the governor and his administration are part of those talks too. So think of a three-dimensional chessboard in some instances. That's what's going on in some regards, because of all the stakeholders at the table that will have a say in what's in and what's out. And, I've been involved in a few budget processes here, and I've never seen one in which everyone's happy at the end of the day. So just a little pearl there for everyone. Not everyone's going to be happy, and it's a tough process, even when you have folks all in the same party involved, because there's institutional prerogatives at play, there's personalities, there's people's well-being and livelihoods. I thought Ashley did a great job of talking about some of those items in very real components.
I don't have much to add to that. I mean, I think that there is going to need to be a great amount of compromise at some point between the House and the Senate, because they are so far apart. So it'll be interesting to see what gets cut and what remains in the package because of that compromise. I am really hoping that the earned income tax credit refundability piece will be in the final package in some form. That's a policy issue that TCI has been championing for over a decade. And so we're really excited that it's gotten to this point. And we'll certainly be taking a victory lap if it makes it into the final package. But in terms of influencing the work of TCI moving forward, I mentioned previously that equity is at the core of who we are as an organization. And so regardless of what is in the final package, we're going to just keep doing what we're doing and shining a light on the barriers that face low-income Virginians and people of color, and not just shining a light, but working to dismantle those barriers and replace them with new and more inclusive systems. And doing so by really partnering with impacted communities and bringing more people into the work and working to shift the power so that in the future, it's going to be the directly impacted folks who influence our budgets and our legislation moving forward.
Great. Thank you both for that. So we do have the first question in the chat, and I just, again, want to encourage everyone to drop their questions or their comments in there for either or both of our speakers. Erik, this is from Mary Donnan. I really appreciate your overview and priorities. Some of the strengths of workforce and education levels seem to be weighted towards urban areas. And I'm curious if there are some parts of the Chamber's agenda for which you anticipate a particularly good fit for rural areas of the state.
Well, thank you, Mary, for that great question. And I think it's a pretty astute observation. I think, back towards the beginning of the pandemic in early 2020, there was a McKinsey study that came out that talked about how do you drive economic growth in different centers, across the globe. Like how is wealth generated, and how can we do it maybe in a greater way across both well-populated, maybe less populated areas of specific geographies. And they look at kind of the small college town kind of model, if you will. And that's something that, Virginia's got a bunch of institutions that are, economic development generating institutions kind of out there. And so that's one kind of model we explored looking at the blueprint is from a workforce development standpoint, from an economic development standpoint, how can we take our existing infrastructure and really build on that to provide opportunities for individuals. I thought that was an interesting study, but really to get more into your question, I mentioned business-ready sites early as an opportunity for investment here in Virginia. So better expanding Virginia's portfolio. A lot of the sites that are primed for investment and potential economic development deals for those large advanced manufacturing opportunities are in rural areas of Virginia. So think of South Side, think of Southwest, think of areas that are near or in close proximity to interstate highways like I-81, the 64, and other areas. Really making sure that those areas are ready for investment, which is really what the Business Ready Sites program is intended for, I think, is one component. And then making sure the areas have the robust investment in the community college system. We talk about G3 all the time as a really great, and for those that might not know, G3 is the community college system here in Virginia, and making sure that's free for folks that have distinct need to participate and gain the skills they need to be involved in the economy. So that's really, those are a couple different avenues that we advocate for through Blueprint Virginia. And it's not one thing. I will lastly note, and let Ashley jump in if she's got something else to add, but broadband connectivity is kind of critical here. If you don't have access to, and even in some instances, the affordability component, so access is both actually having the ability to gain broadband, but also being able to afford the broadband that's available to you. Very much, and this was put in stark terms during the pandemic, you don't have access to education, you don't have access to remote work or the like, and in some instances you don't have access to healthcare services because those services are over 70 miles away from you in some parts. So investing in broadband, so those unserved areas gain it, I think is a good approach to take, and one I think Virginia is making a lot of headway on. So encouraged to see that.
I would just encourage folks to read the reports put out by the Commission to Examine Racial and Economic Inequity in Virginia Law, not because I was a part of those, but because, especially in the last report we put out, we focus on rural issues, we talk about workforce development and make recommendations for policy change for the future. They've done reports on education and a number of issues, and I would just highly recommend that the General Assembly kind of revisit those moving forward and institute some of the policy recommendations that were made in those reports.
Great, thank you both. I'll just mention on the broadband point that Virginia Funders Network hosted 2 sessions, webinars last fall on this, and both of them are on the website, the VFN website, if you'd like to see those recordings. And additional thinking and work is being done in a small group for those who are interested. So other questions, I can think of a lot for our speakers, but I don't want to take all the time. So I encourage you to post some in the chat, but while we're waiting for others to jump in, I'd love to hear from both of you. You have a group of funders from around the Commonwealth today on this call. I'm curious from each of your perspectives how it is that those funders could best work with your organizations in general and around policy and advocacy. But in general, what's the best way to engage and support the work that you're doing? Either of you can jump in first.
Well, I'm happy to jump in here, and I know, Robin, earlier you mentioned my role with our Virginia Chamber Foundation. I serve as the deputy director over in our 501c3 arm, and we have foundation memberships so we have employers that want to invest in education and research and policy analysis on topics that promote economic growth, that promote a vibrant Virginia. And one way to engage with us is the kind of take a look at some of those resources, see if there's alignment, and reach out to me. I'm happy to put my email in the chat. And happy to talk about how ways we can work together to analyze any specific topic of interest, but also to get you involved in what our foundation board and the like are working on from a policy development standpoint. We receive a lot of federal grants from some of our member institutions to work on some of the topics I talked about. Workforce and education is definitely one of those areas. We're doing a lot in the work-based learning area when it comes to matching employers with institutions of higher education. There, we're working with the State Council for Higher Education on some of those components, as well as the Federal Department of Labor and several other partners we have involved there. So happy to get you plugged into some of our work on that front, because a well-paying job is, a key ingredient to solving some of our most distinct challenges that we have in Virginia, but also globally. So I think that's one way to get involved with us at the Virginia Chamber, and happy to make myself available to anyone that would like more information.
Great. And Erik, you also shared the map of where there are local chambers around the state, which was very helpful, and will be in the slides that we send out after this session if you're unfamiliar with it. So Ashley, how can funders best work with TCI?
Like Erik, I'm happy to have conversations to connect virtually or in person. I would encourage funders to sign up for our newsletter on our website, so you all can get all of our regular updates that we provide generally, but we also try to do some philanthropy, community-specific newsletter pieces as well. I've also been trying to organize coffee and conversations just for the funder community periodically throughout the year. So that's an opportunity to sit with me and perhaps one or two other experts from TCI to ask in-depth questions and to have these conversations. So I'd love to make sure folks are connected to those opportunities. And then I'll just add, this advice is sort of very general, not necessarily specific to TCI, but I think that funders can play a really important role in investing in the leaders of organization, and not just the external work that we do, but the internal work that we do as well, to sustain advocates as we do this really important but exhausting work. And to provide really flexible grant dollars that are, multi-year general operating support with, really creative reporting requirements. That is always really welcome to organizations like ours. And then lastly, I would just recommend that funders really work towards trusting the advocates and the organizations that they're funding with this important work, particularly when it comes to racial equity work and investing in organizations that are led by and rooted in communities of color. Trust is really imperative.
Great. Thank you both for that. On Ashley's last 2 points, I also wanted to lift up that, support for this very vibrant policy and advocacy community here in the Commonwealth is really important, and, important for all of us to keep it going as citizens and as organizations to keep that community thriving. So thank you for lifting that up. We have another question in the comment from Katie Moore. Is there a role for philanthropy or individual citizens during the budget negotiation process? So starting Monday during this special session, and then throughout the remaining weeks until things all get resolved. How can citizens and or funders get involved in that process, or can they?
Well, I believe Ashley touched a little bit on this in her last comment there, so I'll jump in to maybe expand on this almost philosophical question in some instances. What role does philanthropy play when or if the government funds something along those lines? And I'm not sure any one of us can answer that question. It's an individual process in some instances, but there are certainly ways to devote funding and philanthropy in complementary ways to what's going on in both the private sector and in what the public sector is doing. And certainly, I know the Funders Network is very interested in that kind of complementary funding arrangement, where how do you get the most bang for your buck in funding and the like. And I don't think anyone's perfectly solved that question yet, but specifically towards the budget negotiation process, I mean, this is partially why Ashley and Ashley's organization is around, why my organization's around, is because we are true advocacy organizations to weigh in. So in some instances, you could weigh in with us, and we'll add to the chorus there. So let us know your priorities. Hopefully, they're in alignment with one or both of our agendas, and we can add to that. But also, we do live in a representative democracy here, and feel free to reach out to your legislator, especially if they're on the appropriations or finance committees in each chamber, because it seems to be very much still in flux right now with your priorities, and that's one way you can have an impact as well.
Yeah, there is absolutely room to advocate and the need to advocate, and not starting Monday, but starting now. I mean, the budget negotiators have been having ongoing conversations and will continue to have conversations after Monday. So certainly expressing what types of priorities you would like to see in the final budget package is imperative. I mentioned our work around prioritizing parents, and that's a campaign that we are working on with a number of partners, and we're going to be putting out a lot of information about that campaign in the coming days. We're going to have a press conference. There will be social media ads and opportunities for people to weigh in and send direct emails or phone calls to their legislators and talk about those three cornerstones of prioritizing parents, funding education, making the tax rebates more accessible, and making the EITC refundable. So if you stay tuned to the TCI website and to our social media, we'll certainly be sharing opportunities for folks to weigh in on those pieces.
Great. Thank you so much. And I'll also just put in a bid that developing relationships with our elected officials is a year-long process. It's not only during the legislative session. In fact, doing it before then is a good time to do it, and having those established relationships that then you can call on during the General Assembly sessions. So thank you both for that. So we had a question from Albert Walker. Are there DEI opportunities outlined in the blueprint or policy agenda that align with health and racial equity advocates? And Erik, thank you for putting the website for Blueprint Virginia on there. Anything else that you want to add?
Yeah. Well, very specifically, Albert, thank you for the question. And we actually, under our healthcare and life sciences section of the blueprint, so if you pull down the focus areas tab there and go to the healthcare and life sciences section, we have a distinct subsection there on the social determinants of health and getting at health equity in particular. And so we've got several targeted policy recommendations around that area. And one other note I'll make on that, and happy to dive into any specifics that folks might have questions on there, but we do have a healthcare and life sciences industry council that meets quarterly, and they really guide the implementation of our blueprint. So now that we have our updated plan, it is their sole focus to implement the recommendations of blueprint. They're not all going to happen just immediately all at once, but our focus is to make consistent and trackable and evaluatable change on some of these topics over time through lots of different ways. So advocating in the General Assembly is certainly one of those avenues. Work within our foundation and grant programs that we're involved in, certainly another. And then the exchange of thought leadership and networking with that committee. We've got some real leaders on the topic involved in that committee, and we're hoping to make some headway in some targeted ways. So Albert, feel free to review that section and let me know if you've got any questions. And Dr. Bill Hazel is involved there. He is a member of both that committee and our Workforce and Education Committee. So he's distinctly involved and aware and advocating for our agenda on those topics. And we are certainly blessed to have his expertise at the table in those conversations. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that question and the answers. Any other questions? We have two terrific speakers here. I'm going to give you one last chance, but in the meantime, I'm going to see if Katie just wants to pull up. I'm going to make a few final announcements, pull up some slides. So again, thanks to our speakers. So for foundations who are interested in policy and advocacy, I wanted to remind you, if you weren't already aware, that it's next week is the Foundations on the Hill 2022, which is a national event that is sponsored by the United Philanthropy Forum, the Council on Foundations, and the independent sector. There is a conference that you can sign up for from April 5th through 7th with lots of panels and presentations about the policy and advocacy agenda for foundations in 2022. And there are also individual elected official member meetings that can be scheduled as well if you are interested. Virginia Funders Network is partnering this year with Philanthropy Southeast to set up some individual member conversations. And if anyone is interested in that, please contact me, Robin Mockenhaupt, at Virginia Funders Network. And I'd be happy to get you engaged in that, but it's next week. And so we're very excited about our involvement. It's a virtual meeting this year, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that in 2023, Foundations on the Hill will be in person on Capitol Hill. So I just wanted to remind folks about that. And then Katie, the next slide, this is if you are interested in signing up for the program next week. This is how to do it on the United Philanthropy Forum website for Foundations on the Hill. So this is how you can get more information for the conference. And then one last slide. I just want to remind everyone that last fall, Virginia Funders Network put out this publication, The Power and Potential of Policy and Advocacy, a report for Virginia funders. I know all of you have read it cover to cover, but just in case there are people who you know who haven't, I'd encourage you, if you have an interest, to share it with them, and lots of ideas in there about how to get engaged as a funder in the state in policy and advocacy and for the issues you care about. And this is our annual conference that Katie mentioned at the beginning. It's May 3 through 4 at the Kings Mill Resort in Williamsburg, Virginia. You can register online, and we'd be delighted to add your name to the 120 plus who have already registered for this event. But it's a fabulous opportunity to connect with other funders in the state who are interested in things that you care about. And as it says, we are all stronger together if we work to advance opportunities for all Virginians. So we hope to see you there in Williamsburg, and we're delighted to welcome all of you there. So with that, one last call. This is last call to see if anybody else has any other.
Robin, I have one maybe final point, and we'll see if we get any questions. But one other opportunity for engagement with this group. Go to the Secretary of the Commonwealth's website and look at the boards and commissions available there, and see if there's anything of interest. They've got a lot of openings right now for potentially serving on a board or a commission, and they need folks, I guess, from the general public as well as specific expertise that funders might have. Get involved in the process through that way, and it's a basic application process. And I think we need great citizens involved. We need citizens to work on these citizen commissions, and I think that's another great way to get engaged in the process and have a voice. So those opportunities exist regardless of administration, and I feel like that would be a potential avenue for folks to get involved here if you have an interest.
Great. Thank you for that. Ashley, any final words from you or thoughts you'd like to leave us with? We're so appreciative for both of you being involved today.
Just thank you so much for the opportunity. I apologize for my dog barking again. The perks of working from home. But I just encourage folks to get in touch with me if you do have any questions, and again to visit our website and engage with us on social media. Look forward to connecting with folks.
Wonderful. Ashley, Erik, thank you both so much for being involved today. We're delighted to have had you with us. And as we said, we will be sending out the recording and the slides afterwards. So thank you for your engagement today.